Let me know if I'm doing something wrong.
I was wondering.
My name is Trent Leibert. I'm a PhD candidate in music history and theory here at the University of Chicago, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's portion of the Sexuality and Body Politics stream, Eros in Unlikely Places. And we will first have Stephen Haswell Todd presenting a paper, How to Do the History of Autism. Stephen is a PhD candidate in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literature at the University of Chicago. His dissertation is on the conceptual origins of autism in psychoanalysis and phenomenology. His larger field of interest is literature and literary theory in German, French, and English, circa 1800 to 1950. He also writes on political theory, especially Hannah Arendt. And our second paper is by Yasmin Nair, and it is called Queers and Sex Offender Registries. And where are you here? Yasmin Nair is a writer, academic, and activist based in Uptown Chicago. She is co-founder of the editorial collective Against Equality and the volunteer policy director of Gender Just, a local grassroots organization. And you can find more at her website, www.yasminnair.net. So we'll begin with Stephen. We'll have a paper followed by about 20 minutes of questions, and then Yasmin's paper. So over to you, Stephen.
Okay, 2 words just to locate this paper in the context of my larger project at the moment, which is to do the history, or a history of autism. Not, however, a natural history of the phenomenon that is called autism nowadays, but rather a history of the concept of autism. And the intuition underlying this project is that autism has been conceptualized in a number of ways historically, and has not always designated what it designates now. And my intuition is that the conceptualization of autism always exceeds in some way the empirical reality which the word autism is attempting to name, and that the conceptual genealogy of autism lies in many fields, from philosophy to literature, aesthetics, and that, in other words, the history of autism should be opened up to discourses other than the narrowly psychiatric ones. And today I'll be talking about autism, the history of autism, as a history of sexuality. The task of any conceptual history of autism begins with the problematic fact at the very origin of the concept, that is, the birth of autism out of another concept, namely autoeroticism, as found in Freud. We recall that autoerotism in Freud is the name for the earliest pregenital organization of the sex drives, the state of early infancy in which libidinal energy is flowing, but is not collected and centered around the genitals and the reproductive act. Rather, the so-called partial drives each pursue their particular ends, be it to suck with the mouth, to excrete, to look, to feel pain, etc., to ride on a train, as Bersani mentioned in the keynote last night. And from these actions, the infant comes to know a form of pleasure derived from the excitation of its various organs, a pleasure which, the further these acts depart from their original self-preservative functions, becomes the prototype of sexual gratification. Crucial to understanding these earliest proto-sexual behaviors is understanding that the drive satisfies itself, in these cases, fully upon one's own body. It does not look to make contact, whether real or fantasized, with another human being, a sexual object. This character, self-sufficient character, we might say, of infantile sexuality is what Freud terms its autoerotism. And if we are to understand sexuality as anything other than something derivable in all its forms from a dyadic reproductive norm, we must insist on the moment of autoerotism as the grounding of sexual life. For only autoerotism can ground the sexual life in the stage when, for the infant, no object and no other exists. In other words, when all relationality is a relation to the self. And I'll just mention briefly that Leo Bersani, in his reading of André Gide in Homos, has shown quite wonderfully how at least one version of a queer sexuality grounds itself in a form of pleasure that is not only not hetero, but is indeed withdrawn from relationality itself, as he puts it. In other words, not merely homo, but something almost verging on the autoerotic. Returning to Freud's concept of autoerotism, as I was saying, the fact is that the concept of autism was literally born out of it, and at first barely distinguished from it. The first time that autism appears in print, which is in 1910, in an article by Eugen Bleuler, it is given an explanatory footnote, which I will now quote. By autism, writes Bleuler, I understand more or less the same thing as Freud understands by autoerotism. I think it best, however, to avoid the latter expression, as anyone who does not have precise knowledge of Freud's writings will misunderstand it. End quote. Bleuler is asserting, in other words, that autism is functionally equivalent to autoerotism, that they have the same meaning, but that the new terminology is justified insofar as the Eros in autoerotism refers to a specifically Freudian expanded concept of sexuality, which is misleading to non-initiates. Bleuler thus casts himself implicitly as one who does have precise knowledge of Freud's writings, and he did carefully read Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. That is well documented. Bleuler was, by the way, an eminently respected senior member of the German-speaking psychiatric establishment, the director of the famous Burghölzli mental hospital in Zurich, and the mentor of Carl Jung, Ludwig Binswanger, and many others in the psychoanalytic movement. And Bleuler will go on to greatly expand on his concept of autism, all the while, however, maintaining its stated equivalence with Freud's concept of autoerotism. Bleuler will use autism to designate the general condition of being turned away from reality, turned in upon oneself, a state of disconnection in thought and behavior, manifested first and foremost in Bleuler's schizophrenic patients. Thus, Bleuler takes autism or autoerotism, insofar as they're not yet differentiated, out of the infantile domain of its application and locates it in a wide range of contexts. Not only schizophrenia is dominated by autistic thinking, but likewise savage or primitive forms of thought, the life of the child and the world of dreams in general, and, for example, the kind of thinking characteristic of women. Autism thus becomes the name for a certain way of being, a certain quality of thinking and behaving, and it would be seen by his followers as Bleuler's great contribution to psychiatry to have recognized, conceptualized, and most importantly, named this elusive quality. The autistic symptoms as described by Bleuler are of the following kind. I believe that tonight I am going to wed the Princess of Sweden, but I am neither an acquaintance of hers, nor someone of comparable social position, nor have I made any preparations to have a wedding. I am thinking and behaving autistically. In another example, a patient who had convinced himself, this is Bloiler writing, who had convinced himself that we had declared him sane, hears every day from us the opposite. Furthermore, he grasps the meaning of the words and is capable of reproducing it. But immediately thereafter, he once again replaces our view of things with his own, because what we really said has not been brought into logical contact with his ideas. End quote. His ideas, then, lacking this logical contact with what is really the case, are autistic, which is to say, anti-realistic. Now, in a Freudian context, we would expect that kind of break with reality to be motivated by a conflict with reality in the experience of the patient. We would, moreover, expect that conflict to be of a sexual nature, more specifically of an infantile sexual nature, such that the conflict arising between an infantile sexual drive and the reality imposed by the external world would induce the mind to break with that reality and take an autistic turn, as Bloiler would have it. And this is, in fact, exactly how Freud presents things in his late, unfinished paper, The Splitting of the Ego in the Mechanisms of Defense. So in keeping with his asserted Freudianism, we might expect Bloiler to read The Splitting of the Mind, much as Freud in fact does, as a fixation of the libido at the developmental stage of autoerotism. From the symptoms of autistic patients, then, we would read backwards, following the hermeneutic chain of associations back into the patient's earliest life, and we would find there that the patient's autoerotic phase had not been overcome, but was instead repeating itself, manifesting itself as the autistic symptoms. What Bloiler actually says, however, is at first quite mystifying. Hardly 2 years after the appearance of that first footnote, and another footnote, meanwhile, restating the claim of an equivalence between autism and autoerotism in Bloiler's magnum opus, which was his monograph, Dementia Praecox, or the Group of Schizophrenias. Bloiler responds to certain questions put to him by Freud in a letter, stating flat out, quote, "My autism is not derivable from sexuality," end quote. So what are we to make of this? Autism is derived in an obvious etymological sense from autoerotism. Bloiler doesn't deny that. So can he possibly be asserting that he understands autoerotism as not pertaining to sexuality, even as he claims to be using the term in the same sense as Freud? And the answer to this, as far as I am acquainted with Bloiler, is yes. In fact, the dominant rhetorical figure in Bloiler's writings has precisely this form, to assert an equivalence between his concept and the concept of another author, then to negate whatever was most essential in that other concept, all the while, however, maintaining that the difference is in fact inessential and the equivalence persists. Thus, for example, in addition to equating autism with Freud's autoerotism, he will later equate autism with Jung's concept of introversion, saying, autism means the same thing as introversion, with the one tiny caveat that autism can just as well be directed outwards as inwards, manifest itself outwardly. Similarly, Bloiler says to Freud, and I'm of course merely paraphrasing here, "I accept your theory of dreams and a dream interpretation. It's absolutely correct, except for one tiny thing. I don't think that all dreams express unconscious wishes." That is, of course, the essential thing about Freud's theory of dream interpretation. Bloiler says that, well, a dream could just as well be non-wish based as grounded in a wish. The important thing for Bloiler is that the dream thoughts are artistic, not realistic. Thus, in light of these examples, it would be 100% in keeping with Bleuler's general tendencies for him to say, although he does not say it in so many words, something like the following: by autism, I understand the same thing as Freud's autoeroticism, only that autism need not be erotic in nature. It could just as well not be erotic. Now, all of these seemingly contradictory maneuvers that Bleuler undertakes with other people's concepts yield the same systematic result, which is to replace all other psychological dichotomies with just one, the dichotomy of the autistic and the non-autistic, the autistic and the realistic, between which Bleuler will divide the entirety of the thought process. This is what I've attempted to diagram on the Bleuler portion of my handout, which hopefully everyone can at least see over someone's shoulder. The psyche is conceived as a plane, almost like a map, divided into two principal hemispheres, the realistic and the autistic. And you can see furthermore that sexuality in Bleuler's conception occupies a superimposed region of the mind, straddling the realistic and the autistic hemispheres. So you can note that most sexual thoughts lie in the autistic region, and most of the autistic region is composed of sexual thoughts. But there is nonetheless also the possibility of realistic sexual thoughts and the possibility of non-sexual autistic thoughts. Everything is laid out as a set of possible coordinates on a sort of grid. And this reflects what I'm going to characterize as the big difference between Bleuler and Freud. Bleuler's differential concepts are always spread out upon a surface, whereas Freud's lie on an axis of depth. So if you look at the Freud diagram, and I attempted to include a not entirely successful representation of the partial drives there, which you can more or less ignore. The important thing is that Freud's picture of the mind has a directionality to it, a chronology. It's in fact properly historical in nature, and the history is composed of the history of the libido. The stages in the development of the libido, which I've labeled on the left side, the stages follow one another, and the changes in an individual patient's libidinal organization mark out an order of events. They give that patient's psyche a history. They lay out a timeline consisting of a series of configurations of the libido. Obviously, we have to allow for things like fixation and, most importantly, regression within this Freudian picture. But the point is that even something like regression makes reference to the dimension of historical time. There's always a before and an after in the history of the libido. So on the right-hand side, you see the direction of time going in one direction, and in the opposite direction, you have regression, or the process of the psychoanalytic cure. The psychoanalytic cure, that is to say, traverses this history in reverse. It goes from symptom via a hermeneutical process to a historical organization of the libido, where we find the origin of the symptom. And Bleuler's thinking, by contrast, once more, is spatialized and atemporal. He doesn't care why the patient is autistic. What he's interested in is describing the formal differences between the autistic and the realistic thoughts. So when he writes that autism is not derivable from sexuality, Bleuler means that autistic phenomena are not caused by sexual conflicts in the patient. There's in fact no real intrapsychic causation in Bleuler. The notion of causation is replaced by that of association. He goes on to say, autism is simply a psychical process which arbitrarily detaches itself from reality, which is to say, autism is primary. or in other terms, autism is ontological. Now, it should still be stressed that Bloyler's autism remains largely sexual in nature. And Bloyler holds to Freud's techniques of interpretation, which, in Bloyler's view, show us that most artistic thinking reflects sexual desires. This is what Bloyler thought Freud had really discovered, namely the sheer predominance of sexual affects in the human mind, and the mind's tendency to distort reality in accordance with the affects. Bloyler conceives of these as mere natural tendencies. The mind's tendency is to fall away from reality into autistic thinking, and the tendency of sexuality is to express itself precisely in these autistic states. Bloyler goes so far as to accept Freud's theory of infantile sexuality. He fully accepts that many infantile behaviors have specifically sexual meanings, and in that sense he's far more of a Freudian than, say, Jung or Adler, and his break with Freud is not over the same issues. He doesn't think that Freud overemphasizes the sexual, right? Rather, Bloyler's break with Freud is more subtle than that. It's this question of depth versus surface, history versus ontology. Interpretation still reveals the sexual meanings of our thoughts, but this is a kind of meaning with no relation to motivation, force, or causation, no relation to history. If sexuality for Freud runs along this vertical dimension, then for Bloyler, the same sorts of sexual phenomena are simply projected from this vertical dimension onto a horizontal surface where they exist in a kind of atemporal space. It's not historical, it's geographical. It's not causal, it's ontological. And I'm afraid that I won't have enough time now to properly characterize the implications of this ontological turn, but I do want to outline them and gesture towards them. Because what I've said thus far, I think, sounds like a rather generalized account of the difference between Freudian psychoanalysis proper, or dynamic psychology, and a kind of descriptivism reminiscent of 19th century psychiatry. So we could say, well, Bloyler's merely falling back into the descriptive paradigm. But what complicates this picture is, first of all, that this pivot from Freud to Bloyler takes place in a certain relation to the development of the concept of autism. It's not that the notion of autism in itself implies a Bloylerian ontology. Rather, it's that Bloyler's ontology seems simply to rely on the concept of autism as the object upon which it elaborates itself. So autism is what I would call the leading concept in Bloyler's larger project of an ontological psychopathology. The second thing is to note that Bloyler's ontology really did lead us to a new psychopathology grounded in this ontological mode of interpretation. And we can read this retroactively from the people who followed Bloyler. There were at least two later schools of psychiatry who made extensive reference to Bloyler specifically as the prophet almost of a new interpretation of the mind, the first person to really grasp the mind ontologically or phenomenologically. Both of these schools, which I'll name in just a second, in addition to referencing Bloyler, they continued to make much of the concept of autism, and in developing their methods, they continued to rely on autism as exactly this kind of leading concept, the paradigmatic object for their methods, so the exemplary object without which their methods would appear somehow empty or lacking a proper object. So the first of these is the phenomenological school of psychiatry, inaugurated by Ludwig Binswanger, which makes autism into a fundamental mode of being in the world, or of Dasein, and then in a second or third hand transmission, in fact attracts the interest of Martin Heidegger in the 1960s in his so-called Solokon seminars. And the second school that owes a similar debt to Bloiler is what I provisionally characterize as the characterological school. The most famous exponent of this characterological school being perhaps Ernst Kretschmer, who elaborates on Bloiler's autism, and in turn exerts a huge influence on Hans Asperger, who, as some of you know, along with Leo Connor, gives us the concept of autism as we know it today. All of this is much more thickly determined than I can afford to flesh out at this time. But the idea is that, contrary to what has been proposed by certain people in the contemporary field of autism, there is a very meaningful continuity to the history of the concept, a continuity that bridges the divide between the kinds of phenomena that Bloiler was calling autistic and the kinds of phenomena that are now considered to fall under that label. Rather, the label itself has a meaningful history. By way of conclusion, it's interesting to speculate, perhaps, although it certainly remains a speculation, that perhaps something like what Freud originally described as autoeroticism returns in the description of modern autism, autism as we know it, under the aspect of repetition, ritual, rhythmic actions, the regulation of bodily excitations, and perhaps most importantly, merely in the notion of being elsewhere, that is, not desiring or not attending to the immediate human environment, and yet perhaps desiring and attending to something else, something that we continue to conceive of in terms of the self, this auto relation implicit in the concept of autism. We've seen here that not only Freud, but Bloiler too, Bloiler, the founder of modern autism, explains autism in terms of desire, almost as a sort of private erotics of the mind. And if it is an open question in this debate started by Freud's 3 essays, where exactly on the spectrum of desire the sexual proper begins, that is all the more reason for doing the history of autism as a history of sexuality, because the history of sexuality, after all, as it has been done by Foucault, by Leo Bersani, and by many others now, is not a natural history of the genital reproductive form of sexuality. It's precisely a history of the various things that sexuality has at different times designated. And even more broadly speaking, it's a history of those practices which relate the erotic life to the notion of subjectivity itself, meanwhile putting both eroticism and subjectivity radically into question. And autism does this in an exemplary manner, a manner that throws into relief some urgent questions for the 20th century and no doubt also for the present day. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a bit of time for questions before we move on to the next paper.
I think we just have to.
I think the thing about autism, I have a couple of questions or observations about it. One is that it seems like there's a new concept of autism that has just kind of been dropped out of the sky almost. Well, I guess with you going into the background, it wasn't dropped out of the sky, but this problem of autistic people, that is, you kind of give a new insight to it. And I'm really kind of wondering if a lot of this social thing of people speaking of autism as a problem behavior, particularly among, well, of course among youth is what we're usually talking about autistic. And it's like you know, so you have to wonder if it's some imagination that the current psycho crowd is, sorry if you're part of that establishment, has come up with. And but also the issue, you know, like Rosemary Kennedy, who was perhaps what they would define as autistic, had her brains blown out by that guy that was into the lobotomy doctor, I forget what his name was. They had a whole thing on the American Experience, having destroyed something like 300 minds, and she was the most famous one, I'm sure. You know, this guy named him, and he, you know, they gave her this lobotomy, and she went from being a little odd to being totally having her brains blown out.
Yeah, that's a lot to take on. Obviously, right, there is enormous interest in the phenomenon called autism these days, and it is a relatively recent sort of interest, and you're probably familiar with lots of the controversies surrounding the epidemiology and the treatment of autism. I don't feel especially qualified to respond in detail to your question because at this stage, at least, my work is not an intervention into those questions of epidemiology and of therapy. And it's really an attempt to simply bring to light this remarkably rich and varied history that the concept has to it. So maybe without a more specific question being raised, I'm just not, I don't think I'm up to the task.
I guess the question I was trying to say is, do you understand why this, I mean, I doubt that, I mean, I would have to wonder if the people that are currently, you know, talking about autism or the history that you know about autism, it's like naming it as ill-social behavior. It seems like a
well, I mean,
thing to drop out of the sky. Their definition of it, I don't know if they have the same definition.
Right. The definition of it that we have nowadays is more or less the one that originates with Connor and Asperger in 1942-43. So what we know as autism is recognizable really for the first time there. But that makes it a remarkably recent phenomenon. And so I will just say, with respect to these more socio-political questions, perhaps that I certainly do hope that my research will enable us to see things in a broader light. Sorry, one back there and then one up here.
Hi, I have just a question about the relationship between autism and fantasy.
Yes.
And I'm thinking here about Marcuse's work in Eros and Civilization, and the emancipatory possibilities for different forms of sexuality, particularly those that are freed from the bounds of heteronormativity. And so what you've had to say about autism seems to strike a chord there, at least in terms of the possibility for, I mean, dare I say it, a kind of progressive politics. So I don't know if that's something that you'd like to address, but at least maybe at a minimum, if you could just say a little bit about the way that autism relates to fantasy, which is after all itself an interiorized world of desire.
Ah, I see. Okay. I might take this in two parts. So first of all, the question about the politics of autism and the possibility of a sort of autistic liberation movement. There is, in fact, such a movement. It's not. This is not in any way the focal point of my research. So there may well be even others in the audience who know much more about that than I do. But it certainly exists. Has existed for a while now. Has gone through various phases. And interestingly, in one of its more recent incarnations, has begun to model itself explicitly on the gay rights movement and the history of the gay rights movement. So I don't know. I'm not sure on what sort of theoretical level that is being articulated. Yes, there's an effort to conceive of autism as a configuration of desire, and to make a case that that configuration of desire should be allowed in some form or to some extent to express itself in public, let's say, right, rather as homosexuality made the transition from a private matter and a pathological matter to something that could be publicly manifested. Yeah. And then as to fantasy, big question. I mean, a huge question for the psychoanalytic theory of autism. Particularly the role of fantasy in autoeroticism, which is much debated I know Laplanche has a take on this, and many Freudians who've written about modern autism. The question being, what is the status of a fantasy in the earliest phase? Where I mean, when in the development of the infant can we properly speak of fantasized object emerging? But maybe that's not actually what you meant. Is it?
I found that very interesting. It's not exactly what I had in mind, but I suppose I was wondering, at least in part, how definitionally one, or descriptively even, one is able to distinguish between desire that is understood as autistic and desire that might be understood as part of an individual's fantasy life, and so is.
I see. Right. Yes, I see what you're saying, and yes. So Bloiler would not really have distinguished between those two things. He would have said that the role of fantasy in the life of us all is as an autistic phenomenon that manifests itself in everybody every day, right? So Bloiler at the very beginning had the idea that autism is not well, he doesn't use it as something that attaches itself only to a certain group of people. Rather, it's a component of the entire thought process, which is manifest to some degree in every human, but then which preponderates more among certain groups like schizophrenics, but also, as I said, all of those, you know, the savages in Borneo, the children, the poets, the women of his time. He calls all of that a manifestation of the autistic aspect of our thinking.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So I have it front.
You had a question.
Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, thank you. I found what you said very interesting, mostly about Bloiler, in that Bloiler in 1912 actually coined the term schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
That was his term. And prior to that, he did talk about schizophrenia, but I mean, he did talk about autism, but he used it clinically to add it as part of the 4 A's in defining schizophrenia, in which autism was only one aspect of it. Also, in I think it was the 30s, maybe the early 40s, where Leo Kanner, who in dealing with children, coined the term autism to describe certain type of children's behavior. So it's been used mostly as a psychopathological situation clinically, as far as I know.
Well, you're absolutely right. It has always been primarily or paradigmatically a psychopathological concept.
And descriptive.
Yes.
Not psychodynamic, you said.
Right. Well, yes. That's the move. That's the move that is made when you go from Freud's concept of autoerotism to Bloiler's concept of autism. He makes it look like it's simply a rhetorical adjustment that he's making to Freud, when in fact it reflects a change in epistemologies, right? From a dynamic to a descriptive model. Yeah, that's what I hope to have demonstrated precisely. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Stephen for his talk, and thank you also for the talk. So next we'll be hearing from Yasmin Nair and her paper, Queers in Sex Offender Registries.
So thanks to the organizers of this conference and to Greg in particular, who's responsible for getting me here. And also, you know, I do want to congratulate the organizers of this conference, because some of the issues that are being dealt with in these 3 days are what are now defined as taboo subjects: pedophilia, sex offender registries, and so on. And that is actually getting more and more difficult to talk about in various spheres, not just the public sphere, but even in the academic sphere. So I do want to congratulate everyone for honestly having the courage to put together this conference. And let me just do this, so I'm not constantly. So the paper I'm going to present today is based on some material that I've already published about queer people. I use the term queer, LGBTQ, I use queer people on sex offender registries. So sex offender registries, as you might be aware, have become a topic of conversation in recent years, in particular because so many more people are being put on them, and they're fairly draconian, and I'll explain what kinds of effects they have on people who are placed on them as I go forward. But as someone who writes in different venues, I work as a journalist. I'm also a critical theorist sometimes. I'm also a writer. You know, if you go to my website, I have about a string of things I call myself, because I never quite know what register I'm supposed to be speaking from. So, but when I'm working as a journalist, one of my primary functions is really to provide the facts and to talk about what effects, right, issues have on people. And all the while, as you might imagine, I'm constantly thinking about other kinds of analysis that I can't necessarily bring forth into something that I publish as a journalistic report. So today's paper is going to be about presenting some information I've come across in my research and my conversations with various people, but it's also then about trying to unpack the things that I could not talk about, right, in my journalism, and to unpack that in a somewhat different register. I'll explain what that means in a minute. So one of the things that I want to do is, besides presenting some of my findings, is also complicate the very categories that I talk about, which is to complicate the notion of queer LGBTQ people and to contextualize it within a larger framework of contemporary gay and lesbian history and contemporary gay and lesbian activism. In particular, and I may not do more than gesture towards the first one, in particular, I'm interested in two things that I came upon doing this research. The first is, and this is familiar territory for some of you, is the specter of the child. Okay? Everything about sex offender registries is based upon this notion of the child in danger, the child that is battered, the child that is abused, and so on. But what I found fascinating, and this is not necessarily original with me, I remember hearing someone else talk about this many years ago, but what's fascinating about this notion of the child is that it is a child that actually, in essence, does not exist. Right? So all of the hysteria and the panic around sex offender registries often comes about around children who actually don't exist. In other words, you can, for instance, be charged with being a sex offender, and you will then also be labeled a sex offender and a danger to children, even if you have actually had no contact whatsoever with children. Even if the images that you may be charged with having seen are actually not of children, right? They may, for instance, be of gay man who just shaved meticulously, right? So there's a complicated way in which the figure of the child emerges and re-emerges in this whole discourse around sex offender registries. The second is the issue of respectability, which is to say, what I want to do in my work, and this is only the first of a series, and what I want to do is to talk about why is it, especially in relation to queers and sex offender registries, how did this come about? How is it that we have, first of all, this intense drive towards sex offender registries? What does it have to do with contemporary gay politics, right? And there's a whole discourse of respectability. Who are the queers who end up on sex offender registries? Are they, quote unquote, technically queer? And does that matter? So I'll just read bits here and there from this. So just to begin with an origin story, as it were. In 1977, and again, this is just a very arbitrary period that I chose, 1977, Anita Bryant launched a crusade against a recently passed Dade County, Florida ordinance that banned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. As the leader of a coalition named Save Our Children, Bryant and her supporters tapped into an old perception of gays as sexual predators of children. In a now famous statement, she declared, "As a mother, I know that homosexuals cannot biologically reproduce children. Therefore, they must recruit our children." And from this comes, what a lot of us have mocked, which is they cannot reproduce, therefore they must recruit. Bryant's campaign led to the repeal of the ordinance, but paradoxically also became the beginning of the end of her career, alienating her from conservatives and liberals alike. In the years since Bryant's campaign, there has been a palpable shift in cultural responses to gay and lesbian issues, with several polls, for instance, indicating far greater support for issues like gay marriage. But the figure of the gay man in particular as a sexual predator still haunts culture and continues to re-emerge. So for instance, going back a little, 1955, Boise, Idaho, erupted in a sex scandal where nearly 1,500 men were questioned. They were actually just rounded up, questioned about supposedly having coerced underage young men into sexual acts. And of course, there's actually a film about this, I think it's called either it's called 1955 or Hosier, how I forget. But essentially there was no such sex ring. But there was a sex panic that came about at the time. Even as recently as this April, as the gay marriage debate reached the Supreme Court, two married gay men in Connecticut, George Haraj and Douglas Worth, decided to fight charges that they had sexually abused children in their care. In a sign of how differently such cases are still treated in the mainstream press, the website Gay Star News, which is a gay website, headline stated, "Gay couple accused of child abuse go to trial to clear their names." New York Daily, the infamous New York Daily, ran a headline that said, "Gay Connecticut couple accused of raping adopted children will face trial." So there's just always still a distinction between how these issues, even if they're in question, are treated in the mainstream press. Now, as far as 1977 and Anita Bryant go, and this is where I want to start talking about this discourse of respectability. A lot of gay historians and culture critics will tell you that, of course, this was the beginning of a kind of new gay movement, a kind of a gay resistance, right? But as the historian Greg Yeomans just said to me the other day as I was interviewing him, in fact, the whole Anita Bryant matter actually brought forth not so much perhaps a radical resurgence of gay power, but in fact was the beginning of actually a conservative push towards redefining gay issues and the development of a discourse of respectability. So yes, there was tremendous backlash, yes, it was successful in many ways, and so on, but that was also the time period when you start to see the need, right, to push aside the more complicated figures of gay and lesbian history. The man-boy lover, right? The more complicated, messy figures, and actually that's the period when you start to see a discourse of respectability forming. Since 1977, to get back to sex offender registries, SORs, as I'll refer to them, have been instituted in every US state, ostensibly to prevent sexual abuse of minors and others by tracking everyone convicted of sexual abuse. But there has, especially recently, been a huge backlash against them. Mainly because SORs have increased so much in their scope by including even acts like public urination to the category of sex crime, that they've become, for many people, virtually meaningless. Even law enforcement officers will tell you this off the record. In addition, SORs place so many residential and vocational restrictions on offenders that large numbers of people are unable to return to society with places to live or stable systems of support. In Illinois, registered sex offenders cannot live within 500 feet of a school or school building, and there is that distinction. Cannot even apply for trade licenses. In 2011, Illinois mandated that licenses of medical and health professionals convicted of sex offenses can be immediately revoked without even a hearing, and so on. So, and the term sex offender is rarely uttered at polite gay and lesbian public events, raising as it does an older, time-worn stereotype that still causes fear because of its automatic association with terms like pedophile and sodomite. And gay men in particular have always been historically associated with those terms. To date, none of the major gay and lesbian organizations like the Human Rights Campaign or the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force have explicitly taken up a position on issues concerning sex offender registries. In fact, they simply don't touch them. So now, tracing the specific effects of sex offender SORs on queer people reveals that both terms LGBTQ and sex offender are fraught with multiple tensions and definitions. So for instance, not all people convicted for sex offenses obviously are LGBTQ, but the acts which place them on the registries are defined as non-heterosexual or quote-unquote crimes against nature. The circumstances in which queer people find themselves in sex offender registries challenge the applications of such terms and hark to older and still prevalent ideas about sexual minorities. And this is really the reason why, because all this is so complicated, this is the reason why both sex offenses and sex offenders fall into such diverse and disparate categories. And this also explains why it's been hard, in many ways, to mobilize an actually concerted political movement against the prevalence of SORs. So, in terms of children, as you probably are aware, most of the large acts acts, right? Big acts, the omnibus acts that deal with sex offender registries, persecution of adults who might have harmed children and so on, are named after children. Megan's Law. In 1980, 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling was abducted from his hometown of St. Joseph, Minnesota, which resulted in the Jacob Wetterling Act, which was the first one that actually created, there had been sex offender registries before that, but this was the first one that created a database to enable easier tracking of sex offenders. Megan's Law, which we all know about, is an amendment to the Wetterling Act. This is the one that actually created the notification system, what is known as the community notification system, which requires everyone who is charged as a sex offender, indicted, to have to register, right? No matter where you move, you have to register in that town or city. So that's actually what Megan's Law did. And then you have the famous Adam Walsh Act, 2006, named for a 6-year-old abducted from a Florida mall in 1981, later found decapitated. So the Adam Walsh Act was actually initiated by, as you might know, John Walsh, who is also the creator of a somewhat hysterical, paranoid kind of show about trapping and hunting down offenders and criminals of all sorts. It's since been cancelled recently, I believe. Now, as I said, there has been a lot of criticism of SORs. Human Rights Watch, the human rights organization, has called for a massive overhaul. It has pointed out that the US in particular has the most punitive and wide-ranging set of laws for sex offenders. The United States is the only country that has such a panoply of measures covering the lives of former sex offenders. It is the only country Human Rights Watch knows of with blanket laws prohibiting people with prior sex convictions for sex crimes from living within designated areas. Only 6 other countries, Australia, Canada, France, Ireland, Japan, and the United Kingdom, have sex offender registration laws. But the period is usually short. The information only remains with the police. South Korea is the only other country besides the United States that has community notification laws. And as you may or may not know, community notification has proven to be extraordinarily dangerous for people. There have been many instances of people being hunted down and shot in their homes, for instance, because what that simply does is, of course, to put your face and all your details on the web, online, searchable by anyone. And that has been extraordinarily dangerous. Now, registration almost always means expulsion in the end from normal society. It creates a snowball effect, essentially. So registration means that, for instance, in many states you will actually have a license that has the word sex offender stamped on your driver's license, right? So imagine going to a bar and trying to get in, and it says sex offender. That makes it very difficult. Daily life becomes incredibly troublesome for people. It means that you are not likely to get a job in most places. Your employer only has to type in your name. Your prospective employer only has to type in your name, and he or she may choose not to. I did meet one person who had an employer who made a point of employing ex-felons and so on, but of course it was a minimum wage job, and this is, again, the kind of situation a lot of people find themselves in. Living situations can be horrific. There have been, the New York Times and other publications have documented instances of droves of people, groups of people simply moving from place to place, because they literally have nowhere to go. In Los Angeles, in California, one town went about creating parks out of, a few square feet here and there, because you cannot technically live near a park which might have children playing there. So what this particular town did, and I forget the name, was to simply go ahead and start creating parks everywhere it could, which made it absolutely impossible for anyone who's registered. Now, the other issue, of course, is that the categories are so expansive and almost meaningless. So I've talked to people who are registered as violent sex offenders, one woman in particular, but that recategorization can come across for very strange legal reasons. So she had been convicted as a sex offender, and then the law changed so that her designation changed to violent, right? So that it was completely meaningless. So that brings on even further restrictions. You can be convicted as a sexual predator for simply having someone I know, for instance, downloaded images from the web accidentally, immediately removed them, and as he said, I realized immediately they were of female children, I have no interest, I'm a gay man. 2 years later, in the big John Ashcroft Candyman sting, he was indicted, right, and he's now classified as a violent as a sexual predator. Illinois is one of the strictest places, by the way, in terms of how it categorizes sex offenders. So that's sort of the broad history and what happens to people on the registry. As far as queer people are concerned, the presence of queer people on sex offender registries can be hard to detect because details don't say anything about victims except for their ages. So you have to do a lot of digging. Essentially, you have to go around talking to people, asking. A lot of queer people in particular feel that they are pushed out of queer communities once they're designated as sex offenders. Queer people essentially don't want, again, this has a lot to do with historical stigma. In some ways it's understandable, but in some ways it's not, right? Now, as to why we are in this particularly fervent period of sex offender registries becoming stricter and stricter and more draconian, Corey Young, whom I spoke to, a professor in Georgia, said that he thought SORs had become so popular because in some ways the US needs to go through every 30 years through some kind of intense sex panic, and right now it's sex offender registries. But perhaps more importantly, and I think this is where Young's research is so important, is that he connects it to the drug wars in a way. And he says that what is happening right now is that it is enabling the greater policing and surveillance of people, and the greater, and what a lot of people against the prison industrial complex will tell you is that it is also enabling the greater expansion of the prison industrial complex. So essentially the term sex offender is so broad and so capacious. It includes public urination, for instance. It includes having accidentally seen an image and so on. That it is another way, like the war on drugs, to expand surveillance and policing mechanisms upon various communities, particularly vulnerable communities. So, you know, I'll just sort of go, I can talk a little bit more later about queers and being targeted, but for now I just want to end with this, which is to say that when it comes to thinking about how queers get on sex offender registries, the matter becomes really complicated because not everyone who is, because of this whole, the way in which sexual acts sort of play across sexual identities, right? So not everyone who is picked up for an act against nature is even, the term would be, a lot of people are non-homosexual identified, and that sounds very awkward, but what happens is a lot of people, for instance, engage in street economy sex, which means that they may engage in non-heterosexual sexual acts, right? What are seen as non-heterosexual sexual acts, but are themselves not identifying necessarily as homosexual, right? So in that case, and I think this is one reason why when queer LGBTQ lawyers and activists take on the issue of sex offender registries, they try to do it with blinkers on. They look for queer people. So when I speak to lawyers, they say, well, yes, we of course believe in sex offender registries. We just don't want queer people on them. In other words, they don't want the gay and lesbian identified people on them. But when you consider that sex offender registries have to do with this very sort of muddy, contentious, right, zone of sex and sex acts and economies, then the question becomes, are we not supposed to, after all, completely, and this is where I come from, is to completely dismantle the sex offender registries for everyone, right? But what has happened so far is, for instance, certain groups will look at sex offender registries and try to get their communities out. So in Louisiana, for instance, recently, and I'm all in support of this, there had been a move to place female sex workers on sex offender registries. And after some great activism, that particular clause has been removed. But it still leaves other people on sex offender registries. And in Louisiana and New Orleans in particular, this has been linked, very much linked to street economies and the gentrification of New Orleans in the wake of Katrina, right? So there's a way in which sex offender registries and who gets placed on them and why is very much linked to the neoliberalization, actually, right? The gentrification, the privatization of the economy that we're witnessing as well. And Erica Miners, one of the activists I spoke to, refers to sex offender registries as the ideological scaffolding of the prison industrial complex, which is to say, has become one of the most effective ways to increase the scope of the prison industrial complex. I'll start to end there, but I'll just simply say that the point, in terms of the queer and sex offender registries, needs not to be to simply rescue the queer and remove the queer from sex offender registries, but to question and contest what the category can mean, and to question the very existence of sex offender registries.
Thank you very much. We're running a little over, but we have some time for questions, and then we can certainly continue this on during the break. So I saw some hands up here.
Yasmin, starting out with 1977 as you did was correct, and that's kind of a turning point, not only for the gay movement to grow, but also for this witch hunt against gay men to be gaining steam, which it has continued to gain. And for other reasons for it, or other manifestations of it in 1977, which are very important, were two witch hunts that were launched against gay men. One was the Body Politic in Canada, which is a gay paper, one of the most important gay papers in the world, was raided by the Canadian police for having published one article which was entitled Men loving, boys loving men, about boy love, and it was a very tame article. And the second thing that happened in 1977 was the raid on the Revere, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, where a so-called sex ring of men supposedly having sex with boys took place. And that was unfortunately also encouraged by the only lesbian gay legislator at the time, Elaine Noble, who urged all the citizens to call a hotline the district attorney set up to report all gay men that they knew about that were supposedly having sex with boys. It turned out those men in Revere they had a relationship with boys that were all teenage boys. But out of that grew NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association, which was formed a year later to defend those men and to try to educate people about the issue of man-boy love. Of course, what's happened since subsequently is that NAMBLA has been completely ostracized by the gay and lesbian movement, which as it's become more and more bourgeoisified.
Thank you for that history.
I just wanted to point out two things. One thing is, you probably have read, there was a very good article in the New Yorker in the last few months on sex registries, and about how people who go online have never, as you point out, have ever had sex, but people who like dialogue with somebody who's supposedly a teenager, and it turns out they're talking to an FBI agent, and they've actually never had sex, or view things online that are considered. So you made that point, but I wanted to say about the New Yorker, I don't think there's any gay publication in America that would have gone as far out as the New Yorker did in discussing this issue. And another point of public information, Patty Wetterling, the mother of Jacob Wetterling, recently came out and said that sex offender laws had gone too far. I don't know the exact details of what she said, but she was actually critical sexual offender laws. So that was very interesting that she did that, which was kind of a surprise to me as I'm from Minnesota.
Right, I have the quote here, but I won't take a lot of time with that. But yes, she did come out against them, yes. She actually says, we need to keep sight of the goal, no more victims. We need to be realistic. Not all sex offenders are the same. Not all sex offenses are the same. We need to ask tougher questions. What can we do to help those who have offended so that they will not do it again? What are the social factors contributing to sexual violence, and how can we turn things around? Which is a very remarkable restorative justice framework, actually.
Any other questions?
Maybe I was a little unclear on this. You're talking about people who have been convicted. Thank you. People who are convicted of sex offenses under this sort of category of like crimes against nature.
Right. Yes.
That terminology, and I just what?
Right.
So that
it still exists. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Which is I
in
think
mostly southern states. Right.
Well, and I mean, it was interesting for me to observe my own shock upon hearing those words and recognize, oh yes, right, I live in like a liberal urban bubble, right? And these are things that still exist elsewhere in the world. So is part of the concern then that the people who are engaging in what would otherwise be considered perfectly sort of normal sexual acts, those that are not otherwise criminalized except for their homosexual nature, are being placed on sex offender registries?
That's it, but it's also a way to keep alive the specter, the context of the sodomy statute that was struck down in 2003. So the bizarre thing is that what that actually did, and the reason why actually many sensible gay activists did not really think much about the 2003 decision, is that it only applied to private consensual sex between adults. Right? So what's happened in Louisiana, for instance, there's a case of two 14-year-olds who've been placed on the sex offender registry for having consenting oral sex, but they were picked up because they're not adults and because they did it in public. And this also has a lot to do with public sex and a lot to do with how we define what kinds of sexuality can or cannot exist. Does that get at answering your question? Only because everything you opened up is so massively complicated.
Yeah,
yes,
no, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that definitely helps clarify the specific point.
And that's also why it helps to rope in street workers, street sex workers in particular. So that's what's going on outside of Central Halsted in Chicago, for instance, where a lot of young black queer youth are being picked up, and they can be charged with various things because they're not adults. Because, all of those reasons.
I can see how that's rather strategically
very strategically
structured to
yes.
to allow it to function in other ways to help pick up and kind of like, under one umbrella a number of different.
Right. They help clean up neighborhoods.
Oh, right. Yes. That's so nice.
Any other questions before we break?
Yeah, and we can also talk maybe a discussion about just the respectability discourse as well, and the gay marriage movement and hate crime. Just the sort of trinity of causes that the gay movement is particularly wedded to, which is hate crime legislation, the military-industrial complex, and gay marriage, and how that connects to SORs, which most gay organizations are not touching.
Would you articulate a minute on hate crime laws?
Sure. I mean, hate crimes law, and that in some ways gets connected to what's going on with the PIC with sex offender registries. Hate crime laws are an easy way for the state to define a group as in danger or more vulnerable than others, right? So it increases its penalty enhancement, which can also in many cases lead to the death penalty. And the queer community has been in great favor of it, except for radical queer prison abolitionists, because all it does really is, first of all, and Fran Lebowitz puts this much more humorously than I can, and if you can find that online, it's a hilarious thing. She says, there are already laws for murder, there are laws for violence. What does it mean to actually pick upon certain kinds of crimes and decide that some people need to go to jail for much longer or even face a death penalty? So there's that critique of hate crimes laws that comes from within the queer community. which you don't hear about very much. Well, you do, and then it gets blanked out. And
well, we have a short break before the final session of the day begins. So I'd like to thank Yasmin and Stephen for their talk. And hopefully we can continue this discussion outside.